So you're welcome. And so really with alcohol, again, you're looking at it, it's a central nervous system depressant. It starts to go up. You need more and more because you develop tolerance, but there's a peak to that. And once you peak, then it'll start going down the other side. And it's inevitable. This is something that's really universal with something like alcohol. Uh, there is a peak and then there's a decline. It's one of the ways that I think of that drugs and alcohol lie to you because it starts out being fun. And this is my point to be kind of critical of the DARE program. How many of you went through the DARE program that I know was very popular there for a while? And it was real popular when I was working as a diagnostician in a junior high. God, that was back in the 90s. Time is flying. Uh-oh, internet connection unstable. Stop that. Okay, apparently I'm back. Every time I get that notice, I'm going to kind of hesitate before I say anything more because I don't know if you're hearing me or not. But back when I was working in that junior high and they were doing the DARE program, I found out it was kind of a double-edged sword. They give you about half good information. All the stuff they tell you about the bad things drugs can do to you are pretty much true. What they don't tell the kids is that initially it's fun. And what happens so often with the kids is they hear all these things in the program and they think, okay, well, these are the adults are telling me these things. And so there's got to be some credibility. And then they have some friends that start using. And when they come across these friends when they're using, they're having fun. They're giggling, they're laughing, they're having a good time. And so, a lot of times they say, here, try it. You'll have fun too. And at first you go, no, I don't. No, they told us it's bad. Said, no, it's not. It's fun. It's a good time. And so then you try it and you go, it is fun. And now you think they lied to you. They didn't. The bad stuff doesn't come till later for the most part. Most people don't turn into immediate alcoholics or addicts the first time they try. Although, like I mentioned yesterday, when a person who's going to be an addict does something for the first time, it kind of turns that key in their brain and they think, oh, I found the key to life. And that is a bad start because that is a very, very strong indicator that you're going to have problems with that drug if you keep doing it. That should be the warning that, uh-oh, I better never do that again because I'm going to have troubles if I do. And having said that, that's easy to say and hard to do because once you get that feeling, it's like, I'll never forget when I was teaching in prison one time when we were talking about drugs and we got to talking about heroin, which we will hear in a little bit. And they described the first time that they ever did heroin as feeling like the best orgasm they'd ever had. Well, that's pretty attractive to want to do again. And so no matter how much you can tell yourself that even with the knowledge beforehand that if you ever experience something like that from a drug, you better never do it again. Whoa, the attraction is going to be mighty, mighty powerful to do it again. So you've got those things working against you and against the DARE program because they don't tell you it's going to be fun. But what they also should mention with the fact that it's going to be fun is the warning that it lies to you. It's not always going to be fun. And here's a thing that I have to deal with my alcoholics and drug addicts is that the things that people tell themselves when they first start using, like this is fun, stay in their heads. And thoughts cause feelings. I'm going to talk more about that later in the term, but that's a basic principle of a lot of the therapy that I do. Thoughts cause feelings. And if you're telling yourself throughout the time that you're using drugs and alcohol that this is still fun, even when it no longer is, that's something you have to combat in order to finally quit. You have to start examining those early thoughts you had when it was enjoyable, when it was fun, to tell yourself, no, this is not fun. I mentioned yesterday, I used to be a smoker. And when I quit, I really started dealing with these thoughts I'd had from when I first started smoking, that I always had a baby face. I got carded to buy a drink one time when I was 35 years old. I just never looked as old as I am. And it's just genes. I can't take any credit for it. Both my parents were pretty young looking, even into their old age. So I got carded then. But imagine as a teenager, if I wanted to get a drink, that wasn't going to be easy. So, hey, smoking was going to make me look better, going to make me look cool. And I'll never forget the first week when I was going through, withdrawals and quitting and doing it cold turkey. I was driving and I was in a left turn lane, and over to the right was a car that was fixing to turn left in front of me, and they had the next light. They were going to go before I did. and a very attractive young lady was sitting there behind the wheel. And so that got my attention. And I'm looking at her and her light turns green. She sticks her cigarette in the mouth, screws her face up kind of like this to hold it in her mouth while she turns the corner. And I wanted to yell out the window, thank you. I needed to see that because, man, cigarettes can make you ugly. And it really helped me counteract those thoughts I'd had from when I was younger that this will make me look better. No, it didn't. I'm never going to look like Humphrey Bogart. He's the last person to make it look cool. And it killed him at 57 from lung cancer. So you know how good you want to look and how long you want to live. So, but that's a big part of what happens with when you start doing alcohol or drugs or anything like that. That's how the tools you need to fight addiction, they don't give you enough in a DARE program. Okay. You know, when we deal with alcoholism, it's a very, you know, you'll hear it's a disease. I have a problem with that terminology, and I just went unstable again, so I'll repeat that. I do have a problem with this whole disease model of alcoholism. I think it's much bigger than that, because not just physical addiction, there's a very powerful psychological addiction. And I just described to you how that works. You develop all these thoughts in favor of using drugs, alcohol, things like that. And the alcoholism is one that's very much in that model. A disease is not just a cognitive thing when you're talking to doctors and stuff. We'll talk a little bit more in the future about the difference between doctors and therapists and things like that. So, but they look at things differently than, say, I do. Okay. Any questions on alcohol? It's such a common thing. It's the legal drug we have. They tried about 90 years ago, almost, no, it was about 100 years ago. They passed a constitutional amendment to make alcohol illegal. During that time of prohibition, which ended after about 12 years, people were drinking more per capita than they had been before prohibition had started. There was something about making it that forbidden fruit that made it even more attractive to people. And yeah, so there was a lot of more alcohol drank. So yes, Rachel, we do believe there is a genetic predisposition to addiction. How much of it is biological, it's hard to tease out at this point, but we do know it runs in families. There are certain nationalities that tend to have higher rates of alcoholism. Yesterday we celebrated one of those cultures. I have an Irish background. My last name is an Irish name. And on both sides of my family, I've had alcoholics. I got very lucky. I was not one of them, but I had uncles on both sides of my family. I've got a cousin that's an alcoholic at this point in time. And yeah, it does tend to run in families. It runs within cultures. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, like in France, it's interesting. Sometimes I wonder about the attitudes about alcohol, because in France, and this is an environmental contributor, what I've read about France is that in their families that they often start their children drinking watered down wine at about the age of 6 with dinner. And so they just kind of grew up accustomed to a little bit of alcohol and not a whole lot. And so their rates of alcoholism are much lower than they are, say, in Ireland. So it kind of depends, but again, you're going to have probably some different genetic kinds of predispositions. Interesting thing about cultures, though, and this is, you know, with these ancestry.com, you know, send in your DNA and we'll tell you where you came from. The bottom line is, with humans have moved all over the place throughout human history. You know, a friend of mine who thought he was Irish, sent his thing in, turned out he had more Scandinavian in him. But that's ignoring the fact that the Vikings spent a lot of time coming down to Ireland back there in about 1,000 years ago, and they were leaving their DNA. They weren't just plundering. So I got to decline a phone call, so sorry about that. So he was surprised, and I had to tell him, look, you can still be very Irish and just have Scandinavian DNA. That's where the red hair came from. It wasn't the original Irish in Ireland looked more Italian than they did what you see today. So yeah, that Scandinavian DNA is there. So if you ever send off your DNA to be analyzed, understand that it's an approximation, and that those ancestors that tell you they were originally from Hungary Well, Hungary was named after a tribe from East Asia that conquered, it made it all the way to Central Europe and conquered Hungary. So yeah, now having gone off on that tangent, yes, we do believe there's a genetic predisposition. If you have a family member, especially a direct line family member who has alcoholism, beware. It doesn't mean that it'll happen to you, but it could be a problem. So you do want to be very careful about that. Any other questions that I might take forever to answer on alcohol? Get off on my tangents. All right, let's talk about other central nervous system depressants. First one is one we don't see too much anymore. It used to be very common in the 50s and 60s. And this is a major tranquilizer, barbiturates. They used to use these to treat anxiety. And yeah, they'd really calm you down, highly addictive. One of the things that I've heard from my, what we used to call downer addicts, is that barbiturates might be a worse detox than anything else out there. They say that it's worse than heroin for some reason. I'm not sure why the biology of that would be. I do, I've already told you about heroin, but with barbiturates, it is a very powerful tranquilizer. And it's also something you want to be very careful about mixing with anything else. In fact, I'm going to give you one of those college words which you want to walk out of here with. One of the things you should always walk out of college with is some new words to impress your friends and family and stuff. This is one of them that you want to have, but it's also a word that's going to be apply to your own profession, because you're going to be dealing with giving drugs to all sorts of animals out there. And what we call this is synergistic effects. And barbiturates and alcohol is a classic example of what I'm about to talk about. Each one of those things can knock you for a loop, altered consciousness wise, even make you pass out if you do too much. In fact, okay, unstable again. I'm waiting a second. In fact, you can literally die from too much alcohol. You can overdose on alcohol and die, because again, you're cutting off oxygen to your brain if you do when you're just drinking a little bit. When you cut off too much oxygen to the brain, that will be a cause of death. In the end, that's the ultimate cause of death, no matter what the other cause might be. A heart attack cuts off oxygen to the brain. All of these things work that way. Okay. What happens with the synergistic effect is if you drink something and do a barbiturate, this is not 2 + 2 = 4. What you get with a synergistic effect is a multiplier. It'd be like 2 + 2 = 10. So you're not going to have just the effect of, say, 2 drinks and one barbiturate. You're going to have, it would turn into something like 10 drinks and 5 barbiturates. There was a lady when I was a kid that used to be on one of those game shows that, and her name was Dorothy Kilgallen. I can still remember that for some reason. And to go to sleep at night, she would have to take a shot of whiskey to take her barbiturate, because they would be effective as sleeping pills too. And it killed her one night. She took that and she had built that tolerance up and had gone back down again. She wasn't aware of it. And she took her shot, just her shot in her barbiturate like she did every night, did not wake up the next day. So yeah, these synergistic effects can be very, very important, very powerful. And not only is it something you'll deal with in your professional life, but chances are if you get old enough, you're going to wind up on more medications than you are now. And it's good to know that your pharmacist is more likely to be able to protect you than your doctors will. The doctors aren't as familiar with the medicines as the pharmacists are. Doctors have to know a lot of other things, like how to diagnose and treat and do other treatments and stuff like that. The pharmacists only deal with medications. That is their one thing they do. And more than once I've had, my clients have had pharmacists that when they took a new prescription to them said, you can't take this with the other stuff you're taking. And it would be because of these synergistic effects it will have. And that's not even just side effects. This is just a multiplier. So that's an important word to know. And it's a very important concept to know, both in your profession and your personal life. Okay, now these barbiturates, because they were so powerful, it spurred the research to find something that wouldn't be nearly as addictive. It was, it was pretty obvious how addictive these barbiturates were fairly early on. So they came up with something that they called minor tranquilizers. I can't spell, and my spell check isn't fixing it. Yay. And this is what we call the benzodiazepine class. And to make it even more simple, this is the drugs that the group of drugs that includes Valium, Xanax, there's a number of them out there. Those are two of the more common ones: Klonopin, Ativan, Librium. There's quite a few of them out there. And these are the ones that are commonly used now to combat anxiety and some other things. They turned out to be addictive too. When they were first put on the market, it was felt like, okay, we found the answer to the barbiturates. We found something that will calm anxiety, calm down the nerves, and it won't be addictive. And yep, yeah, it did. One of the amazing things that until recently, the opioid crisis has changed the atmosphere around this. But I could not believe how many doctors, including psychiatrists, had no clue the addictive properties of some of these drugs they're prescribing. And so they just hand them out like candy. And that caused a lot of problems. It's been in the news, as I'm sure a lot of you have seen. You may have known somebody at this point in time who got into the opiates, and it doesn't end well. These drugs here, especially Xanax, of all the benzodiazepines, Xanax seems to be the one that's most commonly a street drug, called bars, and amongst other things, of course. And they can be highly addictive and dangerous. In addition to the dangers I've talked about, both of these tranquilizers and alcohol, of course, really impairs the ability to drive. So they will often have little warning labels. How many of you read the warning labels on your medicines when you get prescribed? Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, whatever. If you don't, it's kind of like if you don't tell me in the office, I probably won't. I'll probably ignore them. But of course, at this point, I've got a good idea of what those drugs will do. So these are very widely prescribed. I have a number of my clients taking them. I worry about the ones that take it like 3 or 4 times a day. It's much easier to get to the point where that's not going to be enough, because these two drugs are two more great examples of the ones you build up the tolerance to. I've gone unstable again. I paid my bill. It shouldn't be becoming unstable, but you'll go up that curve of tolerance and then boom, hit it and go back down again. So, and that's when your habit can start getting real expensive if you're not prescribed it and on Medicaid, which will pay for your medications. So they're dangerous. They're not toys. The clients that I feel the best about are the ones that get it and only take it when they need it. And so they don't take it every day. It's like if their anxiety goes up, they can grab one and take it, and they only take it as needed. Those are the ones I'm not worried about. You're not going to get addicted if you do it like that, or at least you shouldn't. But that's much better that way. Now, I've had a couple of clients that they took the same amount for years, and they never. I mean, yeah, in a way, they were addicted by doing it that way, but they never abused it. So, and I always like for them to, because they would worry about it. They go, well, am I a drug addict? And I said, you're taking a medicine that you're actually addicted to, but you're taking it as medicine and not using it for a drug, like a street drug. As long as you can do that, yeah, you're right on the edge, but you're not a drug addict. You're just a prescription needer. So, yeah, our new dog Hannah is staying by me this morning, and so she just got fixed a couple of days ago, so we're watching her real close so she doesn't play with her stitches. So far, so good. So if you see me kind of get distracted a little bit, I'm just kind of watching for her to do anything like that. So, all right, one more central nervous system depressant to mention, you know, I already have ones, are the opiates. Yeah, these were designed originally to be painkillers. You know, it started out with opium, which they took the poppy plant and converted some kind of chemical within that into opium, uh, which is a great pain reliever and also somebody that'll just mellow you out quite a bit. And then you go from opiates, they decided, you know, that wasn't quite as good a painkiller as what they needed for severe injuries. So they developed morphine. I think that was early in the 19th century. Um, so they were using morphine, even by the Civil War. I know that they were using opiates or morphine on wounded soldiers in that war. So, but then they found out that was addictive too. So they then developed heroin from there. It's like a progression. You build the opium, and then you take the opium, you move it into morphine, then you treat it some more, and you get the heroin. And heroin, again, was designed to be a painkiller, and it truly is the best painkiller we've ever devised yet. And it works really, really well. It's philosophically speaking, it's kind of a sad thing that we can't give it to people who are terminally ill and in great pain, because if they're terminally ill, what does it matter if they're addicted to heroin or not? You know, maybe we can ease their passing, if you will, using the best painkiller that was ever invented. But we don't allow that. So, but these things, as I'm sure most of you have seen in the news or through personal experience from people you know, they're highly addictive. They're highly dangerous. They do tend to kill. Part of what happens with opiates, the way that you overdose on them is kind of interesting, because opiates will depress the respiratory system. And if you do too much, it will shut down your respiratory system. That's generally what happens when you have an opiate overdose. There was a guy that they were putting to death with the injection in the Texas death chamber several years ago. And his last words were, "Oh, I know this, it's a drug overdose." And that was the last thing he said right before he died from the drug overdose they were giving him. And one of the interesting things about the overdoses is it often happens to heroin addicts who are doing it in a different environment. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about classical conditioning. And in classical conditioning, you kind of learn a behavior because certain things happen. With a heroin addict, right before they rig up and shoot up, they will start just naturally, they start breathing more. They take in some deep breaths, they get some oxygen into their system, then they'll shoot up, okay? And they will start doing that when they're in their normal place of use. When they are somewhere else, then they don't necessarily do that. That classical conditioning of saturating their body with oxygen doesn't kick in. So when they do the heroin, it doesn't even have to be more than what they normally do. Then the respiration slows down as much as it did before, but they don't have the oxygen, and that's when it will kill them. Okay, so that's a very kind of fascinating clinical angle to look at with these addictions too. But the other thing that can also happen is most of the street heroin is only about 10% heroin. It's cut with anything. Strychnine, cornstarch, you name it, just any kind of white powder can go in there to be the other 90%. And then every now and then, some will come along that might be much more pure, maybe 50% heroin. And that's going to be enough to make them overdose too, because that'll be enough to shut down the respiration, even in their normal environment where they do their classically conditioned breathing exercises. So they don't even always realize they're doing it. They just start doing the breathing ahead of time. It just becomes part of the routine. And but if you got too much heroin in there, yeah, it won't matter at that point in time. Okay, any questions about these opiates of any kind, of all the central nervous system drugs, tranquilizers? Don't ask me where you can get them, okay? I don't know. I don't want to know. Yeah, laudanum is, the question is, have you ever heard of laudanum? And yeah, that was an old treatment it was part morphine. And what was the other part? There was two parts of it. It was a painkiller. It was very effective. addictive, of course. You know, it's still available. I think that you can get that through prescription. It's pretty rare, of course, but yeah, it is still out there. It's still available through prescription. It's just very, very rare, very controlled. At least I know I knew somebody who had gotten some as a prescription back in the late 80s. So perhaps that's changed at this point, but yeah, laudanum, sometimes in like an old Western movie, you'll see that being prescribed. There's a John Wayne movie where it's one of his later movies. I think he comes down with cancer and Jimmy Stewart is the doctor and he prescribes him laudanum. But it's half morphine, half something else. Somebody want to Google that. But yeah, that is one of the classic old medicines that they used to do. I mean, Coca-Cola originally had cocaine in it. That's where the Coca name part of it came from. And you know, it's kind of like when you put something addictive in your soft drink, that's probably going to get people to buy plenty more of it. So it might be. Now, Susan, I can't off the top of my head remember exactly what was in it. I haven't thought about laudanum in a lot of years. So I'm gonna have to Google that, unless somebody else wants to Google it and throw it up there on chat or something. That would be okay too. Okay. Any other questions? No, they didn't. All of these drugs, they didn't know at first they'd be addictive. I don't think they wanted them to be. It's just that once people started using them, and you know, you don't know immediately normally the first time you use it. Even though I mentioned the thing about the key turns, that's more of a recent development in our understanding of addictions. Back when cocaine was first around, or morphine, or any of those things, nobody knew they were addictive until people started using them and using them continually. I read one time where the heroin doesn't become an addiction until you've done it for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. I forget exactly which, but 2 or 3 weeks every day in a row. At that point, you're going to be addicted. Now, codeine is another form of opiate. Codeine, it used to be over the counter. When I was in high school, you could buy cough syrup with codeine. I mean, I could go buy it at 16 years old if I wanted to, which if I had a cough, I would. Not because it was addictive or because I want to get high, but because codeine is a very effective cough suppressant. And I have been prescribed codeine for cough medicine ever since then. I'm unstable again here. So, all right. Now, so yeah, codeine is definitely available by prescription. And it comes with all the warning labels and stuff like that. I don't believe they ever really hand out enough where you probably get addicted to it, but you might decide you like it a lot and go find it on the street or something. So, or just go back to your doctor. I'm still coughing. You know, doctors can be fooled about that stuff sometimes. So, any other questions on these? But yeah, codeine used to be just right up there over the counter. They didn't know that was addictive. Even in my lifetime, it was still legal over the counter. So I guess nobody that did codeine was going to be coughing very much. If they were smokers and didn't cough, you had to test them for codeine. All right. So any other questions on the central nervous system depressants? All righty then. I'm going to talk about stimulants. We've been talking about downers. Let's go to uppers. Oh, one more thing I wanted to mention about alcohol. A lot of people don't realize that it's a depressant because usually the initial effects are a little bit more euphoria, a little bit more, I feel good, now I'm relaxed, you know, and it kind of fools you into thinking it's a stimulant. What's going on, as I've mentioned before, is that it's going to the frontal lobes of your brain and kind of relaxing the governors of your behavior. So some of the things that would maybe keep you from doing things are now okay. You feel a little better about doing that kind of stuff. I can dance, so that makes it a stimulant. No, it's just depressing certain things like how you behave. No, okay, it's okay for me to go do something like dance. So that's why it's a depressant and not a stimulant, because eventually it just keeps depressing. Do you get to the point where you can't speak, you can't walk, you know, you don't make good decisions, you certainly can't drive, okay? So I wanted to forgot to mention that, and I did want to mention that. All right, so let's look at some stimulants. Let's go up instead of down here. And the first one we'll look at is amphetamines. I think I spelled it right. But amphetamines were like one of the very early, is actually one of the very early treatments for depression. They figured if they could speed you up, because depressed people are down, right? They speed you up, then yeah, you really can't, you shouldn't be depressed. No, it didn't work. It just made the depression go faster. So you stayed depressed, you just had more energy with it. And like, okay, I really feel bad now. And so then you grind your teeth and all the rest of that stuff. Another highly addictive drug. If anybody's ever seen, methamphetamine, meth is just one form of amphetamines. It's easy to make, from what I understand. And I had an inmate, one of my inmate students, tell me he'd been the speed king of Fort Worth, is what he told me his title was. And back in those days, when you got out of prison, TDC would give you some clothes and $100, and that $100 was enough to get you a bus ticket. And the bus station was right across the street from the Walls unit there in Huntsville, and you could go over there and you could get a ticket to any town in Texas to get you back there. Heck, you could probably get several states over, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and all that, but you could easily get out to El Paso, so you could get home doing that. And he said that really, that with the money left over from his bus ticket to Fort Worth, he could go to a junkyard, get the parts, and then he could just get the rest of the chemicals he needed in a drugstore and make his first batch and be on his way to making a whole bunch of money again. And he said, the reason I'm telling you this is I'm no longer going to do this. He was a middle-aged guy, so maybe he was, sometimes, and I'll explain this in another chapter, that sometimes guys like that do change. They do turn over a leaf and kind of find themselves, grow a conscience, if you will. So who knows? I mean, I never saw the guy after he finished taking my classes, so I don't know what happened to him. But I hope so. We don't need a whole bunch of people making methamphetamines out there. So, but that one is a stimulant. It will really increase your brain activity, and that's what these things do. They really fire up your neurotransmitters, and they make your brain cells communicate. They're gonna talk to each other really fast, and then you're gonna turn around and talk really fast too. In case y'all ever wonder if I'm on it, I had to quit caffeine, which is a stimulant, but I had to quit it because this is me normally. I don't need caffeine. So yeah, I was never attracted to stimulants. It's like, nah, I don't think I need that. But okay, another one that's pretty famous, cocaine. The origin of cocaine was, of course, it came from South America originally, and the indigenous peoples down there, especially the ones that lived at high altitudes in the Andes, where this stuff would grow naturally, they found that they could just chew the leaves, and it would give them the energy they needed to work the fields all day. And so that was kind of how that all got started. And of course, they took the leaves and processed the chemicals out of them, made a little white powder out of it, and said, hey, we've got some people up in North America that would pay big money for this stuff. So let's start doing that. And yeah, and then the rest was history. I remember listening to, I don't know how many of y'all listen to rock and roll very much, but it's like two distinct periods of it. Up until about the mid 70s, there was one form of it, and then it kind of really got strange after that. And I remember reading an interview with one of the old rock stars who was saying, what changed in music was in the early days, it was all pot and acid, and then cocaine came along. And I've gone unstable again. This is getting old. But anyway, they said, yeah, then cocaine came along, and it just changed everything in the music business, the people who were doing it and all that kind of stuff. But cocaine was one of those, it was kind of the cocaine always, I'll never forget working with, it came at first, it was just powder form. People would snort it, maybe inject it, but then they changed it into the freebase, where I've never seen it done, but I believe what they do is they kind of cook it somehow and then smoke it. And then they turned it into the crack cocaine, where they continued the chemical process, till it turned into these little crystal rocks, and they would smoke that. And it's the stories I'd hear from my cocaine and crack addicts who just, it's like, why do you do that? It just sounded like the most unpleasant experience. You know, they talk about that little bump they'd get, and I go, you pay that much money for a bump? You know, come on. A peanut butter and crack sandwich. Yeah, that sounds appetizing. I guess that means you got crunchy peanut butter. I don't know what peanut butter would smell like when you smoke it though. I'm not thinking that'd be so good.
That's from Dave Chappelle.
I'm sorry, that's the foundation for it?
No, so Dave Chappelle used to make these skits of like this one character. He was a crack addict, and like he would just be putting crack on everything or trying to do random things to get crack.
I got you. Yeah. Yeah. You know, addicts will do that kind of, they'll do anything to get their drugs. It's, yeah. Yeah. Some of their behaviors make me look normal. So that's not easy. Yeah. But I'll remember I was talking to one crack addict that was in the hospital trying to get sober. And he talked about that he'd get you know, it was like one of the funny things he said is you can always tell when it's payday in a crack neighborhood, you know, the first of the month when they're getting their checks because everybody's walking really fast across the neighborhood heading for the dealers. He said, then when you get it, they go check into a motel, start doing their crack, and then spend the rest of the day peeking out the blinds because they're paranoid as hell. And I'm going, why do you do that? That just doesn't sound like any fun at all. You've got to be kidding me. Yeah. So try and challenge him about, come on, you got a brain cell left? You know, what's fun about that? You got to be kidding me. So yeah, I didn't understand how that could be fun. I guess, you know, when they first start, again, the lies are, hey, this is fun. You get that bump, you know, and it bumps you into insanity. It's called job security for me. Okay, another one that's kind of had a run. I don't know if it's still popular or not. Caps. It's called MDMA. It's kind of a combo thing. I think it's cocaine and something else. And again, I used to have this stuff at the tip of my fingers, but it's a combo thing. Then the street name is ecstasy. And ecstasy was, if I remember, I was just coming in the 80s. And it was it sounded like one of those fad drugs. You know, it seems like every drug has its fad period and then it'll fade away and then maybe come back again. You know, there's periods where, what I think in the 90s, there was this heroin chic and heroin became in. And it was like, oh, great. And that was before the opiate crisis here. So, but cocaine had a real heyday in the 70s and into the 80s. And then ecstasy came along and that seemed to be the fad drug. So I don't know where it is now because I guess I just haven't had an MDM, haven't had an addict on that for quite some time now. So I don't know. I still get cocaine addicts, alcoholics, methamphetamine, the speed freaks is what I always call them. Still get those. But yeah, and I'll still run into the tranquilizer addicts, but that's not as much as I used to. I still have plenty of clients that use them, but right now they're okay. They're controlled anyway. So now I'm going to talk about everybody's favorite stimulant. Most of you probably did some of this morning. Caffeine. Fiending for caffeine. And I spelled it wrong. Okay, Rachel, that is a good question. And for years, we did not know why it worked. Why is it that when you give really a form of amphetamines to the attention deficit hyperactivity clients and patients, it would calm them down? We finally came up with a theory that seems to make sense, you know, and just briefly before I go further into that, that ADHD people are people who just have like this need for stimulation. Okay, they're almost, you know, they get bored easily if they don't get enough stimulation, and oftentimes in classrooms they cause problems simply because they get bored too easily. And what we found, the theory behind it now, was that if we give them something that stimulates their brain, like some form of amphetamine, that takes care of their need for stimulation and allows them to calm down and focus. That's, before that, it just never made any sense to me either. And I was well into graduate school before this theory about why it works came out. I thought, well, that makes sense. That's the best anybody has come up with. But for years, they were giving ADHD kids, stimulants, including caffeine. Sometimes a mild form of ADHD, caffeine is enough to calm them down. How many of you know people, or maybe some of you do, that you can drink a cup of coffee and go to bed and go to sleep? Now, I used to work for a sergeant in the Army, a great guy. I mean, back then I hadn't quit coffee yet, but if I had a cup afternoon, I couldn't sleep that night. I finally did quit coffee a bunch of years ago, and I felt better. He would drink coffee all through the shift. This was working those swing shifts that we were working. He'd drink coffee till he was ready to get off, and then he'd go to bed and he'd go right to sleep. Yeah, so that's some of you just, and it's a great example of how everything affects people differently. You can't ever tell somebody to take this drug, this antidepressant, because it works great for me. You have no idea how to work on them. It might have the opposite effect. I've seen that happen with somebody. Had a next door neighbor. It was a Vietnam veteran who'd been through a lot over there and did have PTSD. Really nice guy. And he was just asking me about depressants. I wasn't his counselor, but I could give him information and told him about a couple of that were kind of worked in a different manner. And I'll talk more about these later in the term. But I told him this one doesn't have some of those weight gain side effects, or this one doesn't have like the sexual side effects. And, this is the experience that my clients have had with it. And he took it and it made him worse. He had to stop it within 3 days. So you just never know. You really, really don't. Okay. So, okay. Yeah. Sometimes, just have some coffee and then stick the Adderall in the cup of coffee, and that'll work even better. Whatever it takes. Slow down, kid. The sad part about this too, and when I was working in that junior high, I saw this on more than one occasion. Teachers would come to ARD meetings and say, this kid needs to be on Adderall, they think it was just for behavior control. Or in the case of my youngest stepdaughter, she wanted to take it for weight control. She figured, that would be a way to, suppress the appetite, and she was not hyperactive. And we told her absolutely not. We're not going to do that. But there are parents who will do that for their children. I'll never forget, the saddest case was this one young boy, I think he was in 7th or 8th grade, so working in junior high. And he had problems. He just was one of those kids that didn't fit very well. And so they decided to put him on Adderall. He wasn't really hyperactive, but he would act strange. So they put him on the Adderall or whatever. There's more than one drug they use for it. But they put him on the stimulant. And the next day he came to class and wet himself. Now this really went over well for a kid that, was already having problems anyway. And I'm just thinking, oh God, what are you people thinking? So, that was back in the 90s. I'm hoping they haven't, continued to just pass it out like candy like they were in those days. The problem with doctors is that what they do when it comes to mental health, and I'll talk more about this later, is they just tend to think that, they push pills. That's what they're trained for. They don't do therapy for the most part. So they'll push pills, and they just do it too much. And I'll tell you some horror stories behind that later on too. One more stimulant to mention: nicotine. Do we have any smokers out there? You don't have to raise your hand. So, but I'm an ex-smoker. I understand it, and I won't preach. But there are ways to quit. But nicotine is a stimulant. It's kind of funny because smokers are always saying, I need a cigarette to relax. Nicotine ain't relaxing you. But I'll tell you something funny. This is what I discovered when I was quitting, when I was going through cold turkey. I literally was trying to think of anything that would help, and I'd get these urges. I gotta have a cigarette. I've been 48 hours without a cigarette, and I did something that I don't know what made me do it, but I tried this. I took my 2 fingers like I was holding a cigarette, put it to my mouth, and took a drag of air. And I realized it was that relaxed me. That literally did relax me, that deep breath, and then just blow it out like I would a cigarette. that was relaxing. It's not the nicotine. It's the behavior. And I was like, oh, baby. Yeah, Sally, I had actually quit a month before I went in the Army. I've been smoking for about 3 years. I was 19 when I went in, and I quit. And by the end of basic training, I was I was back smoking again. Ooh-wee. So
Yeah, there's like no possible way for you to be in the army and like not smoke.
yeah, it's pretty much, heck, all the breaks started with smoke them if you got them. So yeah, that's the way we did it in basic and AIT. Yeah, God, those were the days. But they were cheap too. My gosh, they couldn't have encouraged you more. We could get a carton of cigarettes in the PX for $1. Back in my day, I don't know what they're going for lately, but $1 for a pack. Even on the Army salary, you could afford that. So, but luckily, it is highly addictive. So that's another thing to remember about that. I'll never forget one doctor saying, of all the things that we can talk about, there are certainly some good side effects of these things. Even the opiates they're good painkillers. We can say something about positive about any of these things. The tranquilizers can help people with anxiety. The stimulants can help students or people with ADHD. In fact, I know a couple of adult ADHD people that take their stimulant every day, and it keeps them functional. But there is nothing good you can say about smoke. It's complete damage. It's completely bad for you. There's just nothing you can say about it. It's a definite physical addiction, but it's also a classic example of the psychological addiction because of all the things you have to tell yourself to justify continuing to do that habit. There's just nothing good about it. So there it is. Again, I'm not here to preach, but just to give you a description of like some of the differences between these things. All right, now the time I got left, let's talk about hallucinogens. Unless you have questions on any of those stimulants. Yeah, Aaron, that was a thought that they had, and they used to pass around for. There were. I'm old enough to remember those. They used to be able to advertise cigarettes on TV and radio and billboards and magazines and everywhere, and that eventually over a while, once they came up with the links to cancer and lung cancer, and then the other diseases like emphysema and all, then they were able to finally get to the point where it is now, where it's pretty much discouraged. They just haven't ever made it illegal. But I think they thought that, some of the things like I need a cigarette to relax me, that has some old origins. And perhaps they thought that was a way to calm your nerves. People often would do a cigarette after they went through something really hard. Wow, that was a tough thing. I need a cigarette. And so they would maybe it was just kind of encouraged for that reason. Plus, you got to realize the power of advertising. The tobacco companies had a lot at stake here, a lot of money was being made off of selling cigarettes. So they had every reason to want to promote them as being beneficial for you. So, and doctors used to smoke commonly. I mean, it used to be that you'd go into the doctor's room and they'd be smoking a cigarette. You saw them. You don't see that too often these days anymore at all. That kind of is kind of stopped too. So I think that part of it was the marketing and the promotion. It's kind of like what the sugar industry did to animal fats. They promoted fats as being really bad for you when sugar turned out to be the enemy. So, we've come out with that a lot lately. And these days, they used to say sugar is good. And let's face it, sugar can be addictive as well. So if you don't believe me, see if you can go all day without your ice cream or your chocolate. Yeah, some of those old cigarette ads were classics too. They did some good advertising. Okay, they really were part of the language we used when I was young. All right, now, not the chocolate. I'm going to hold up a Ghirardelli square here and torture you.
Chocolate.
You hate chocolate or you love it?
No, I said I need my chocolate.
Okay, see, so there's your addiction. Here's your addiction. So anyway, the book brings in marijuana as an hallucinogen. I don't buy it. I'm sorry. That's marijuana is its own thing. It's kind of a separate drug unto itself. Um, True hallucinogens will cause all sorts of perceptual alterations. You will see things, you will hear things, you will experience feelings, you will have interesting beliefs. Marijuana kind of alters to a degree, but only slightly compared to true hallucinogens. Marijuana is just different, okay? Now, so I'm kind of fighting the book here. And in this particular case on a test, I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying as opposed to what the book is saying. This is where your attendance can help you too. When I tell you things like that, I want you to understand marijuana is not the way the book describes it. Marijuana is different. Its mechanisms are different. Things like LSD and psilocybin and mescaline, oftentimes what they do is they spur the dopamine activity, which is also what happens in schizophrenia. So when you've got more dopamine activity in your temporal lobes, you're going to hear voices. If you've got more of it acting up in your occipital lobes, you're going to see things that aren't there. There's pink elephants over there in the corner. Oh, that's not because marijuana doesn't do that to you. I know that marijuana is much stronger now than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. Our farmers, once they started smoking marijuana, said, say, I can make this better. And so they started putting modern agricultural techniques to work. And so the marijuana, I'll never forget it when I was, that's about 20 years ago when I was teaching in the prison, and I came across something in the textbook I was using at that time, and it was talking about how the marijuana today is about 3 times as strong as it was back then. I'm going, really? Keep it away. That's scary. So, but it is its own thing, okay? The hallucinogens will definitely take you to places marijuana will not take you. It'll take you out there to, you'll step out to the edge of a building. I think there was a famous TV celebrity from the 50s and 60s who had a daughter who thought she could fly literally when she was on acid, and unfortunately she couldn't, and it didn't end well, okay? People don't do that on marijuana, so, but it's a different thing entirely. Hallucinogens, they alter the brain chemistry in terms of how your neurons are firing off and all that good stuff. So, and I think we reached the end of class today. Is that enough on drugs for one day, or chocolate? Is chocolate a drug? That's your study question for the day. Well, your homework is go see if chocolate works on your brain.
You can't. It's Easter, like chocolate comes out majorly when Easter comes around, and them Cadbury
chocolate
are the
is comfortable to peeps, okay? Yeah, I'm not telling you not to eat chocolate. I'm going to eat some today. So, speaking of Ghirardelli squares with the caramel filling, yeah,
What Cadbury eggs?
I'm sorry?
Cadbury eggs.
Yeah, those are addictive too. I actually went to a continuing education thing one time. It was is chocolate an antidepressant? And they didn't end up talking enough about it. I chose that one thinking we'd really get into something different and interesting, but we didn't. So that was disappointing. But the idea is, hey, why not? Try it. That's your homework assignment. See what chocolate does for you today. All right, folks, I guess I should let you go to your next class and let Ms. Huff go turn off the owl. So y'all have a good one. We'll see you tomorrow on Friday. We're going to start talking about how we learn. What is learning? Y'all take care. Yeah. Tomorrow we'll start talking about good ways to train your dogs. It'll be useful information. Y'all take care. See you tomorrow.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mr. Fahey. Have a nice day.
Make
sure he got me.
Stay safe.
Mr. Fahey, did you get Skylar Jones
Yes, I did.
for attendance?
I did.
Okay, thank you so much.
I got you right here. I got you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.